Hi, welcome back. As I indicated in the previous session, we're going a little bit out of synchronization here. We've completed now estate planning, but I wanted to save this last segment to pull together what we might have learnt from the What is Wealth section. Thank you. I'm just trying to put together a PowerPoint to do it, so you can look over my shoulder if you like. What we learnt in the previous 11 weeks, because we didn't have one for the first show, is that you thought that John was wealthier than Fred. It's not an unreasonable assumption. He earned $415,000 a year, he had a Porsche, he had a house in a superb suburb and an investment property in another superb suburb, and poor old Fred, he only had an old Ford and he only earned $95,000 a year, and he didn't look incredibly wealthy, did he? So I'm just looking here and, oh goodness gracious, not with great success. So in episode 10, we learnt that in applying their disposable income and expenses, Fred was going forward by $34,000 a year. In other words, he was actually saving $34,000, whereas John was going backwards by $34,000 a year. He was spending $34,000 from his credit card, which is why he ended up with $50,000 worth of credit card debt. Doesn't make him sound incredibly wealthy, does it? We also learnt that in terms of their net worth, on episode 11, that Fred's net worth was just over $750,000 and John's net worth, because of his debt, was just barely $250,000. So you see, all our assumptions were wrong. We also learnt on episode 12 that if you were living next to both of these boys, and the question was asked, who would you aspire to? It's such an important question. You know, which Jones are you going to follow? Are you going to follow the bloke with the Porsche and the big income and the flashy suits and lots of girlfriends, or the bloke who's got a boring old Ford who sits at home writing computer programs? I know who I'd be tempted to follow, but if I were to have followed John, how much trouble would I have got into, for Pete's sake? He's going backwards by $35,000 a year. I remember a story that was told to me once about a bloke living in a reasonably well-to-do suburb, and he was in a little bit of financial problem. His wife, of course, was on his back because he was always spending more than they earned. He was trying to keep up with the neighbour next door, but unfortunately he was killed. He was killed in a car crash, and he was a good mate with the neighbour next door, so he was actually executing the will. When he got to execute the will, he was in exactly the same position that John was. He was going backwards healthily, and the bloke who the story is about said to himself, well, there am I, been breaking my neck to try and keep up with him, and he's going backwards to the same tune I am. Don't follow other people's goals. We'll come back there. Okay, so let's have a look here. I've done a little bit of work. So we've said, what was wealth? So Macquarie Dictionary defined wealth as a great store of valuable possessions, properties and riches. But hey, that's a heap of rubbish, because that's what John had, and he certainly wasn't wealthy, was he? So we need a better definition. Buckminster Fuller, or R. Buckminster Fuller, obviously he didn't like the R, he's a 20th century innovator. He designed and invented the geodesic dome. He created buckyballs, which are balls of carbon that do clever things scientifically. He's a real thinker, but he also wrote a book called Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. Well worth a read. I think you can even get it as an ebook. And he defined wealth like this. Wealth is our organised capability to cope effectively with the environment in sustaining our healthy regeneration and decreasing both the physical and metaphysical restrictions of the forward days of our lives. Now, what a lengthy definition, okay? It's up on screen, I'll read it again. Wealth is our organised capability to cope effectively with the environment in sustaining our healthy regeneration and decreasing both the physical and metaphysical restrictions of the forward days of our lives. Now, it's a superb definition. It would take us weeks to actually get into the depths of it, but here, let's see if we can break it down. So the first thing it talks about is health. We've got to actually be healthy. There's no point in being the richest man in the cemetery. So clearly having money and dying isn't an incredibly successful outcome. You actually have to have money and live. So whilst you're generating money, you should be maintaining health. Metaphysical, or our attitude to life and wealth. So it's how we feel about it. So I think I've said before, if you've got a block up in the country and it produces most of the food you eat, you might only need $20,000 a year, and that might be your idyllic life. if you want to live in the centre of the city, you're not going to do it for 20 grand a year. So, you know, these things are so important. Physical, so we're controlling a physical environment, and we're controlling an environment that consists of money. Okay, so that very small part of the total definition is what we conventionally think of as wealth. But the other thing that we control physically is time. And time is an incredible concept when you consider it in terms of wealth. So as a measure of wealth, this is expressed in his definition as forward days. It sounded a bit like days of our lives. It wasn't forward days. So forward days basically says, if you live on $2,000 a week and you've got $4,000, you've got 14 forward days. If, like Fred, you've got minus 34,000 or however much his debt was, you've got no forward days at all. In fact, you're already into hock. Let's just use that in that definition of forward days, and I'll come back to defining it a little bit more simply in relation to Fred and John. So let's go to Fred's wealth. Fred was spending $1,833 a month. He's got investments, including his home, of $193,000. So without any growth at all, he can last for 105 months. So his forward days are just over 8 years worth. So, hey, not a bad effort. Not enough, but not a bad effort. Let's look at John. He's spending $19,223 a month. He's got minus $41,000. He's got no forward days at all. If he was to get sick, and he didn't have income protection, let's assume he doesn't, if he was to get sick, he's in real trouble. He's got nothing. So this definition, I'll go back to it. I'm flicking around all over the place here. This definition can be made a little bit more simple in terms of wealth. We can simply define it as an accumulation of forward days, just nothing much more than that. So if we were to be even simpler than that, we'd actually be saying survival time, maybe. But I'm reducing a really complex and useful definition into simplicity that actually robs it. But nevertheless, let's keep it in terms of forward days. And forward days are incredibly useful. They define almost everything in relation to go there, right? So we've got forward days because if we looked at retirement as forward days, it would make things much more easy, wouldn't it? So how many forward days do I need to create in my environment to live the lifestyle I need? How many forward days do I have in my current environment? How many forward days am I missing? If we're talking about retirement, you can only fix those with real money. But if we're talking about protecting your family, so how many forward days do you need to protect your family and the ones you care for that you haven't already got in terms of money? Well, if you're like most of us, probably a lot. And this is where insurance comes from. So if we look at insurance from the concept of forward days, all we're really doing is just buying forward days with insurance. It's an incredibly powerful concept. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw up the definition again for you, and I'm going to let you read that at your leisure as we fade out from this series. Thank you for joining us for the series. I've thoroughly enjoyed having you here. I often refer to you, the viewer, as singular. I've stolen from Philip Adams, I suspect. I hope there's more than one of you. And I hope you join us on the second series, which runs directly on from this. So next week we'll be in the first episode of our second series, and what we will be doing is we'll be doing an introduction, and then we'll be running through Go Dare twice again. Thank you for joining us, and I really look forward to you being with us for our next series as well. Ciao.